So the mission was a growing up experience. I labored in Kankakee, went for a few weeks to Peoria, then went down to southern Illinois to West Frankfort and Centralia. All of those were, in many ways, really nice experiences. I had a range of interesting companions. I had one companion who was very bright and very educated. He's an older man who was really quite sophisticated in many ways. I had another companion who had an IQ of about 70. Probably should never have been sent on a mission, but it was, and my job was to try and help him be successful. Met a lot of really wonderful people, the humility and the generosity of the saints. I remember West Frankfort would have been a town that would have been kind of devastated by economic downturn. And I can remember being invited to dinner at the house of one family with my companion. And I noticed after a while that when we asked for butter, nobody else ate butter but the missionaries, that they could not afford butter for themselves, but they gave it to us. And there were a number of instances in which I met people who were really very generous-hearted and lovely, and who taught me some important lessons. Thoreau says, when I talk about what I learned on my mission, I learned a lot. As I mentioned, I had a lot to learn. I was very immature in many ways. Thoreau says, I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. It is something to be able to paint a picture or to do a sculpture, and so to make a few things beautiful. But far more significant it is to carve the very atmosphere in which we live and breathe. To affect the quality of the day is the highest of the arts. I learned a lot about affecting the quality of my day and other people's day. I learned a lot about how to listen. I learned a lot about making mistakes and how to take responsibility for them. And then I was called into the mission home by President Stratford. I was called in to be the editor of the mission newspaper or newsletter, and to do a number of other things, to work in the office. That was also a very interesting experience. I liked working in the office with the other missionaries who were there. And we would sometimes be able to go out to Chicago. I remember we did something rather naughty. We went into Chicago to the Blue Note, which was one of the great jazz clubs in the world, and heard Count Basie and Big Joe Williams, and it was a wonderful night. Someplace there is a photograph of 4 missionary lily white faces among a sea of black faces. But we had fun. Richard Stratford was as strict in his way as President Smoot was not, but the saving grace was his wife, Sally Stratford, who was a hoot. And I remember one experience, President Stratford was going off to some conference someplace, and she went to the front door and said, "Bye, sweetheart, have a good time, we'll see you when you get back." As soon as he went, she slammed the door, threw herself against it, and said, "He's gone, let's have a ball." But that's who she was. She was just this, she was the mission mother in the sense that you always want somebody like that to be. But it wasn't long after I was in the mission home, I was called to be a traveling elder. So I was called along with Bud Stevenson to travel throughout the mission, meeting with and training missionaries. And that was also really an interesting experience and a wonderful learning experience. I still am in touch with Bud. We're friends to this day. But it was interesting to travel way up to the cold country of northern upper Michigan and out to Nebraska, and to meet with the missionaries and to to have opportunities to work with them. It was really a delightful experience, and again, it gave me really good opportunities for leadership. When it came time for my mission to be over, President Stratford asked if I would extend, and so I stayed an extra 2 months to help him and to to help train missionaries and to pass on at least a little bit of what I had learned. I then went back to BYU and resumed my education. And one of the things that had happened when I was on my mission was one of my companions turned out to be a really dear friend, Jim Marshall. He and I became really close friends. So we lived together when we went back to BYU. At BYU, before I went on my mission, I was a C student. When I came back, I was a serious student, and I had a couple of straight A quarters, and was fortunate enough to be elected into an honor society. And as I continued to increase my knowledge, I minored in French and took a wonderful French class from J. Reuben Clark III. I spent summer between my junior and senior years in studying French at the University of Laval in Quebec, Canada. And that was also a wonderful experience, to live with a French family and to learn or try to learn French. Had a lovely experience in Quebec. I hitchhiked back home from Quebec to BYU. Those days I didn't have money to travel, so I hitchhiked across the country and got back to BYU in time for my senior year. And during that year, I began preparing for graduate school. I also, when I came back from my mission, Ruth Stanfield was at BYU, and knowing her from Long Beach, she lived with a bunch of girls from Long Beach, some of whom I had dated, and I started dating Ruth, and she kept breaking dates, but I was really persistent. I can't tell you how many dates Ruth broke with me, but there was something about her, and I can remember when I went back to BYU, a group of missionaries that I'd served with, we lived together, and I remember one night, this is when we had meetings in the Sunday school in the morning and sacrament meeting in the evening, and Ruth was in a different ward than I was, and I knew she led the singing in that ward, and I was friends with her. I was really quite interested in her, and I said to my missionary companion, who was now my roommate, I said, let's go over to Ruth Stanfield's ward tonight. So we did. She stood up to direct the singing. I turned to him, I said, that's who I'm going to marry. It was news to her, but it wasn't news to me. There was something in her demeanor, kind of dignified sense of character. She was also pretty. So that's when I started dating her seriously, when she was seriously not wanting to date me, but I persisted. She became engaged to the student body president at the University of Utah, but that didn't deter me. She was the one I wanted. So we dated for a while, and then went home to Long Beach that summer, and then I went off to the University of Wisconsin to start graduate school. I was fortunate to be a finalist for the Danforth Fellowship, and so I was a Danforth Associate and got a National Fellowship, a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, which was quite a prestigious fellowship at the time, and that gave me the money I needed to go to graduate school. I also knew I had to work, but it was really a very nice scholarship. And so I started graduate school in the fall of 1960 at Madison, Wisconsin. Drove a little car, a Volkswagen. I had enough money to buy a Volkswagen Bug, so I drove that Bug to from Provo, went to Provo, and then on to Madison, and began my graduate studies there.